At the age of 13, my grandmother went from being a colonial subject of the British Empire to a citizen of a free India. She was barely literate, had no possessions, and lived in a refugee camp. She was one of the over 12 million people forced to migrate as part of one of the largest human displacements in recorded history. One hot and dusty day, a gentleman came to the refugee camp where my grandmother and her family were staying, looking for his surviving relatives, since many people traveling towards their new nations had died along the way in violence that was perpetuated by fanatics, both Hindu and Muslim. In fact, 2 million people died in the violent partition of India and Pakistan, and over 100,000 women were raped or abducted. My grandmother was a beautiful teenager, and fearing for her safety, her family decided to take advantage of the stranger's visit to the camp and arrange her marriage to him. Education hadn't done much for my grandmother, since as a girl, she wasn't allowed to go to school. For my grandfather, however, he had a high school diploma and a couple years of college, and this allowed him to land a job at an Indian company and slowly inch his way up the ladder of social mobility. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, the same year that my grandmother got married at the age of 14, enshrines within it a right to education for all children. I learned from my family history to value education as the one thing that couldn't be taken away despite war, forced migration, or famine. While in college, I became interested in schooling as a fundamental human right and began to travel internationally for research and community service projects. As I visited worn-down shacks and shanties in places like Haiti, India, and Zambia, it was hard to believe the signs outside indicating that these outposts were in fact schools. I want to also mention that these countries also have some of the finest educational institutions that cater to upper and middle class students, but I was most interested in the type of education provided to the rural majority. What chances was schooling providing to these children who similarly sought to acquire the one valuable good that I learned could never be taken away? I remember visiting a primary school classroom in Tanzania. There were over 100 children in a single classroom with a single teacher. Hardly any of them had shoes, and multiple students were huddled around each textbook, memorizing content that might increase their chances of scoring well on a national examination, and that might allow them to continue on past primary education. Figures show that only 30% of children in sub-Saharan Africa are able to attend secondary schools due to limited capacity, eclipsing the hopes and dreams of the majority of students and rendering them failures for no fault of their own. I began to wonder then, though education has been declared a right all around the world and scores of children have entered primary school in the past couple decades, what kind of education could create the critical thinking, the active citizenship, and the respect for pluralism that might foster true human and social development beyond projections of economic returns? This question led me to explore more fully the second part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that affirms that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The initiatives that seek to develop these values are called by many names: social justice education, peace education, and more literally, human rights education. These efforts are taking place across the globe and seek to align the content, the pedagogy, and the structures of education with peace and human rights principles. The idea is to teach about peace and for peace such that education becomes a tool for individual and social transformation. The good majority of what I've taught, what I've researched, and what I've written about for the past 12 years has centered around these efforts and students' experiences within them. I believe peace and human rights education efforts are worth our time, our support, and our scholarly attention. Here's why. Fatima was 18 years old and in the 12th grade when I interviewed her in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Fatima is one of 4 sisters in her family, and as the eldest, she was supposed to be killed in the practice of female infanticide that her community believed in. Her grandmother intervened to stop her death, and Fatima was then sent to live with that grandmother, who subsisted on very meager wages as a sweeper at a local school. Fatima had some contact with her mother, but her father was an alcoholic and had left the family, and she didn't know where he was. She grew up doing many domestic chores and barely staying in school due to her family's need for her labor. In the 6th grade, a non-governmental organization, or an NGO, introduced a 3-year course on human rights to her school, training teachers who would then offer a class on human rights twice a week for 3 years in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. The textbooks provided by the NGO were more interactive than the other subjects in the conventional Indian curriculum, and of most interest to Fatima and her classmates was that there were no exams. Fatima noticed changes in her teachers after they went to the human rights training. They stopped beating the children as a form of punishment, they took more interest in their students' lives, and they started showing up to schools more regularly. On any given day in India, an average of 25% of teachers are absent for no good reason. So the fact that they started showing up more was indeed notable. In Fatima's own words, she states, "I started learning about human rights in grade 6. I first thought, they're giving us more of a burden with yet another subject and more books. But the teachers were so different after they started teaching human rights. Human rights teachers talk nicely to us, they don't scold us, they don't beat us. They encouraged us to try new things and cultivate different talents like dance, poetry, drama, and singing, and everything. Other subject teachers just teach their subjects and they beat us also. They put the pressure of other people on us. But the human rights teachers release us from that. So I thank God for the introduction of human rights. Through this course, I started writing poems about women's rights and children's issues, and my human rights teacher encouraged me to send it to the newspaper when I was in the 8th grade. They liked it and even published it. I'd never ever thought that something like that would happen. My grandmother can't read, but I showed it to her in the newspaper and she was so happy. I kept writing poems and made a collection of 125 of them. My teacher encouraged me to put them together in a book and even got donations from the other teachers and a discounted rate from the publisher. They're putting all the proceeds of the book into a bank account in my name so that I can go to college. I can't imagine what my life would have been if this human rights class would not have been there. I thank my teachers and the NGO for introducing it in our school. When I grow up, I would like to do a lot more in the field of human rights. Fatima is now in college and even gaining notoriety as a budding poet. And then there is Swati, who was 13 years old, who I met in a rural village in the eastern Indian state of Orissa when I interviewed her. The year prior, when she was in the 6th grade, her parents told her that they were pulling her out of school to get her married. The economic circumstances were such that they couldn't afford another mouth to feed, and they had found a family not demanding too much dowry, so it seemed like a good opportunity. Swati was studying human rights and did not want to leave school to get married at such a young age. She took a friend and went to the police to report what was going to happen to her. Getting married before the age of 18 without consent, the asking and providing of dowry, and being pulled out of school before the age of 14 are all illegal actions in India. The police, however, told Swati just to listen to her parents and not to make trouble. With her human rights textbook in hand and referring to the phone numbers of state commissions and NGOs listed in the inside cover, Swati demanded that the police take some action. Scared that maybe she would report them to her teacher or to the NGO that might have contacts in the state capital, the police were convinced to talk to her parents and encourage them to delay her marriage and let her stay in school. Since then, Swati's become a leader of her human rights club at school. She attended a statewide training for young human rights defenders, and she plans to finish school and teach other people about children's rights. In both Swati's and Fatima's eyes, I see the hopes and aspirations of my own grandmother, whose dreams were curtailed by conflict and inequality. The human rights education course that these young women were taking allowed them to dream beyond, at least in the short term, what social structures, what their families, and what their gender seemed to have in store for them. The powerful message that we all have the same rights, that we all deserve the same guarantees, allowed these young women to view themselves as part of a larger global community in which their access to limited resources need not translate into an unequal citizenship. We can keep demanding education for all, as many international efforts have done, but it's really important to consider education for what? The authoritarian leader of Zimbabwe, who is accused of tremendous violence, Robert Mugabe, is also one of the most educated men of his generation, holding multiple higher education degrees. Many of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge who authored the Cambodian genocide were highly educated individuals in that society. Scholars have shown that schooling and textbooks have contributed to stereotypes that sparked ethnic and religious violence in places like the Balkans, Rwanda, and the Middle East. Here in the United States, we keep hearing examples of school shootings and violent bullying in educational institutions across this country. So if schooling on its own is not a panacea and can be a positive or a negative force, then the infusion of peace and human rights concepts into education can instead orient the process towards the broader social good. As noted Brazilian education scholar Paulo Freire has said, education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Peace and human rights education is an opportunity for learners to critically analyze the conditions that surround them, pursue participatory dialogue, and ultimately engage in the practice of freedom in and with the world around them. It was a chance that my grandmother was denied, and that no future generation should be. Thank you.